The morning Kathleen Brennan's stepfather threw her trunk into the Dakota snow. The thermometer outside Bismarck read 14 degrees below zero. It was February 1878, and she had turned 16 just 3 days earlier. Her mother stood at the kitchen window, her face turned away in silent complicity, while Thomas Brennan pointed toward the frozen horizon and told Kathleen she had brought shame enough to his house and could make her own way now. Her trunk held 2 dresses, a heavy wool blanket, her late father's old hammer, and exactly $4 in silver coins her grandmother had sent before she died. Kathleen dragged that trunk half a mile before the feeling bled completely out of her hands. She had been accused of meeting a railroad worker behind the stable, a mini remain and me or were, an accusation entirely fabricated by her stepfather's sister. But in the brutal arithmetic of the frontier, truth mattered far less than the convenience of a scapegoat. Standing there on the frozen, rutted road with everything she owned in the world, Kathleen did what any frontier girl raised hard would do. She started calculating. Town lots around Bismarck were selling for a minimum of $25, and boarding houses demanded $1.50 per week. Her grandmother's $4 wouldn't even last until the spring thaw in March. But she remembered a conversation she had overheard. The Larson boys talking about how their uncle had survived in a dugout for 2 years down in Nebraska, never paying a single cent for the land, simply carving his shelter directly into a hillside south of Omaha. That notion anchored itself in her mind as she walked toward the settlement, her feet losing all feeling inside boots that had once belonged to her mother. By noon, she had secured work washing dishes at the Northern Pacific Dining Hall, a grueling job that paid 35 cents a day plus 1 hot meal. The owner, a stern but observant widow named Mrs. Halterman, allowed her to sleep on empty flour sacks in the unheated storeroom for 2 weeks while Kathleen searched for a permanent arrangement. That is when she found the eroded bank along Apple Creek, 3 miles west of town. The land did not belong to anyone yet, as far as the county recorder could tell her. It was just open territory where the spring floods had carved a natural vertical wall into the earth, rising about 9 feet high. Kathleen walked out there on a Sunday in late February, studying the southern exposure of the bank and the thick stand of old cottonwoods towering above. She had grown up watching her biological father, Michael Brennan, build everything from chicken coops to lean-tos before a sudden fever took his life in 1874. He had taught her how to read the grain of raw wood, how to judge the load-bearing capacity of a foundation, and the most fundamental law of frontier engineering: water always finds the lowest point. Standing at the base of that frozen creek bank, she could see the entire design perfectly rendered in her mind. It would be a dugout cut directly into the south-facing slope, extending 8 feet deep and perhaps 10 feet wide, with a front wall built up from the creek bank and a roof fashioned from heavy cottonwood poles covered in thick prairie sod. If she engineered it correctly, the total cost would be maybe $8 to $10 for forged nails, a few salvaged boards for a door and a single window, and some tar paper to seal the gaps. If you are the kind of person who values practical wisdom over popular opinion, who understands that the old ways hold secrets modern convenience has forgotten, subscribe to help preserve these frontier techniques. Also, comment below. Which city are you watching from? Kathleen started digging her shelter on March 3rd, 1878. The ground was still frozen solid for the first 6 inches down, an impenetrable shield of ice and clay. She gathered deadwood, built intense fires against the bank to thaw small sections of the earth, then furiously dug while the soil was soft, before building another fire to repeat the agonizing process. She worked in the pitch-black cold before dawn, and immediately after her exhausting shift at the dining hall, surviving on perhaps 4 hours of sleep a night. The blisters on her palms opened, bled, scabbed over, and tore open again. Mrs. Halterman noticed her ruined hands and asked what fool project she had gotten herself into. When Kathleen explained her architectural vision, the older woman simply shook her head. Dugouts were for desperate men and sod-busters who didn't know any better, she warned, not for girls who ought to be finding husbands. That was merely the first piece of doubt Kathleen would endure, but it would certainly not be the last. Werner Hauptmann, a man who ran the local lumberyard and had immigrated from Prussia in 1869 with rigid ideas about proper European construction, was equally dismissive. When Kathleen walked into his yard asking about the price of 6-penny nails and what specific species of wood would best resist rot underground, he set down his ledger pencil and studied her as if she were a simpleton. He boasted that he had built 17 proper houses around Bismarck, and not a single one involved digging into the freezing earth like a frightened prairie dog. The subterranean moisture alone, he lectured, would rot any timber she placed down there within 2 years. Furthermore, he predicted catastrophic cave-ins the moment the spring snowmelt saturated the soil, and insisted that even if she managed to build it, the structure would be darker than a root cellar and twice as damp. He sold her the 50 pounds of nails anyway for $6, but he made absolutely certain she knew she was throwing her meager savings into a muddy grave. Then there was Frank Cordell, a prosperous man who owned the land 2 miles upstream. He rode by while she was waist-deep in her excavation and stopped his horse to watch. Cordell had homesteaded his stretch in 1872, built a proper frame house with a shingled roof, lost 3 fingers to frostbite during his first bitter winter, but persevered until he had 80 acres of wheat under cultivation. Sitting tall in his saddle, looking down at the hole Kathleen had carved 5 feet into the bank, he asked if she truly understood that prairie winters could plunge to 40 below zero for weeks on end. She would need a real house with double walls and a massive iron stove, he insisted, not some primitive hole in the ground. Dugouts, according to Cordell, were what ignorant settlers built when they first arrived. They were strictly temporary and never meant to last. But the skeptic, whose words carried the heaviest psychological weight, was Father Dunn, the Catholic priest who had known her family since they arrived in the territory in 1875. He cornered her after Mass one Sunday in late March. When she explained her dugout project, his face cycled through a dozen expressions before settling on profound, patronizing concern. He warned that he had seen far too many settlers lose everything to poor planning and arrogance. Pride was indeed a sin, he counseled, but foolishness was far worse because its consequences rippled outward. A young woman living entirely alone, 3 miles from the safety of town, in a dirt shelter. What would happen when she inevitably fell ill, or when the winter storms sealed her in for weeks? He offered to find her a proper situation, perhaps as a hired domestic servant for a respectable family, framing it as Christian charity. Kathleen politely thanked him for his concern, turned her back, and kept digging. Nature doesn't care about your pride. The detail that separated Kathleen's methodical approach from every failed, collapsed, and rotting dugout these men had ever seen was the quiet wisdom she had absorbed from her father. Michael Brennan had built a root cellar into a hillside behind their old Pennsylvania farmhouse when Kathleen was just 9 years old. Carefully explaining every step of the physics while she handed him his tools. "The earth is either your friend or your enemy," he had told her, "depending on how you treat it. You can't fight the water, so you work with it. You can't ignore the cold, so you use it. And you never, ever assume the ground will stay where you put it without help." She excavated the main room 8 feet deep into the Apple Creek bank, precisely sloping the dirt floor toward the entrance at a calculated grade of exactly 1 inch per foot. This imperceptible pitch meant that any intruding water would naturally drain out, instead of pooling lethally against the back wall. The back wall and the 2 side walls were carved at a slight, deliberate angle, leaning inward at roughly 10 degrees, a geometric choice that provided immense structural strength and drastically reduced the likelihood of a cave-in. Every single night, she took a heavy, flat board and methodically tamped the walls, compressing the earth until the heavy Dakota clay and glacial till locked together, becoming as solid and unforgiving as fired brick. But here is where her vernacular engineering verged on brilliance. She dug a highly specific, separate channel running directly along the base of the east wall, measuring exactly 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep, stretching from the deepest back corner straight to the front entrance. This interior channel sat just below the main floor level. Its purpose was to catch any subterranean moisture that might seep through the compacted clay walls, directing it effortlessly out the front door. Outside, she dug a second intersecting channel, a deep drainage ditch designed to carry water safely away from the structure during the violent spring thaws and torrential rains. The entire integrated system was entirely gravity-fed, requiring no mechanical pumps, operating on the exact same hydraulic principles as the ancient Roman aqueducts she had read about in a borrowed schoolbook. By mid-April, the excavation was complete, and she began constructing the front wall. Unable to afford cut lumber, she hauled heavy creekstone by hand, building the lower 4 feet of the wall and mortaring the rocks with a highly engineered mixture of local mud and dried prairie grass. She had learned this composite technique by observing sparrows build their resilient nests. Through relentless trial and error, Kathleen discovered the perfect ratio: 2 parts dense clay, 1 part dry grass, and just enough water to make it workable. It cured as hard as commercial plaster. Above the stone, she framed the upper wall with green cottonwood poles harvested from the upstream grove, leaving rough openings for a door and a 2-foot square window. She purchased a warped, rejected pine door from Werner Hauptmann's lumberyard for $1.20. For the window, she traded 2 grueling weeks of Saturday mornings assisting Mrs. Halterman with heavy laundry in exchange for 4 small panes of glass salvaged from a burned-down building. She set the glass into the frame using her custom clay grass mortar, meticulously sealing every micro gap with sticky pine pitch collected from the nearby trees. The roof, the point of catastrophic failure for most pioneer dugouts, required a structural masterclass. Most desperate settlers simply threw thin poles across the opening and buried them under tons of raw sod, a method that inevitably led to muddy cave-ins during the first heavy rain. Kathleen knew she required a dynamic system that would shed liquid water while simultaneously supporting the crushing dead load of 2 feet of wet earth. She felled 23 individual cottonwood trees, cutting poles that were 7 inches in diameter and exactly 14 feet long. Her father had taught her that cottonwood was a poor structural timber because it rotted quickly compared to oak or pine, but it was abundantly available for free. To counter the rot, she painstakingly debarked every single pole with a borrowed draw knife, with a poisse de faux borrowai, pulling long strips until the wood gleamed white. She then rubbed the raw timber down with a deeply penetrating mixture of linseed oil and heavy tar that she had purchased from the local hardware store for $1.60. This chemical vapor barrier would buy her years of structural integrity before fungal rot could even take hold. She laid these treated poles across the opening, spacing them precisely 8 inches apart, spanning from the solid back wall to the stone front wall. Then came her most unconventional layer. For 2 months, she had been stockpiling old discarded newspapers from the dining hall and the general store, accumulating a stack 3 feet high. She laid these broadsheets across the timber poles in tightly overlapping sheets, creating a primitive but highly effective vapor barrier that would radically slow water penetration and trap dead air for vital thermal insulation. Over the paper, she spread a dense layer of dried prairie grass, packed tight, before finally adding the crushing weight of the sod. Cutting that sod was agonizing labor that threatened to destroy her spine. Using a heavy spade, she cut strips 3 feet long, 12 inches wide and 4 inches deep, slicing directly into the thickest root mass. Each wet piece weighed roughly 30 pounds. She hauled them up onto the roof 4 at a time, resting only when her vision blurred, laying 2 alternating layers perpendicular to each other, so the seams never aligned. The finished subterranean dwelling measured 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 9 feet long internally. The ceiling height rose from just over 6 feet at the rear to 7.5 feet at the front wall. The total financial cost, carefully tabulated down to the penny for the nails, the warped door, the linseed oil, and the tar, came to exactly $9.45. She moved into her earthen fortress on May 6, 1878, dragging her trunk, a few empty flour sacks, and a stub of a wax candle. That first night, lying in the dark, smelling the cold, wet earth, she wondered if the chorus of arrogant men had been right all along. Perhaps this was profound foolishness, but when she woke the next morning, the brutal physical reality of her engineering proved itself. The outside ambient air temperature had plummeted to a bitter 38 degrees overnight, cold enough to leave heavy white frost on the prairie grass. Yet, inside the unheated dugout, the air hovered comfortably around 55 degrees. The massive thermal mass of the surrounding Earth had absorbed the solar radiation from the previous day and was now slowly, gently radiating it back into her living space through the night. It was the exact principle of thermal lag, an elegant dance of physics that required absolutely no effort on her part. Summer arrived with violent intensity, the mercury routinely striking 95 degrees by July. The heat was so oppressive that Mrs. Halterman was forced to send her kitchen staff home early twice a week because the dining hall became an unbreathable oven. Kathleen would walk back to her dugout under the blazing sun, strip down to her thin shift, and step into a dark, quiet sanctuary that permanently hovered between 65 and 70 degrees, utterly immune to the solar bombardment outside. She had furnished the small space, each with a rope bed frame against the east wall, hanging shelves from the heavy support poles, a table built from scrap lumber, and 2 chairs earned through extra dishwashing. She had even purchased a cracked but functional iron stove for $3 from a defeated family fleeing back east. The first true test of her architecture came in October. A torrential biblical rain began on October 17th and did not cease for 4 straight days. This was the kind of deluge that transformed dirt roads into raging rivers. Werner Hauptmann's pristine lumberyard suffered severe flooding. Frank Cordell lost an entire storage shed to the punishing wind and water. And 3 conventional homes in Bismarck had their basements entirely filled with muddy runoff. Kathleen sat perfectly dry in her dugout, listening to the rain hammer the thick sod roof, watching through her salvaged window as Apple Creek swelled from its docile 2-foot depth to a terrifying 8 feet. The floodwaters crept to within 30 yards of her stone entrance before receding. Inside, the environment remained as dry as a church on a Tuesday. The precise interior drainage channel she had carved along the east wall flawlessly caught the minor moisture, seeping through the back wall, directing it out the door, into the exterior ditch, and safely downhill into the roaring creek. Perhaps a 1/4 cup of water made it onto her main floor, which she calmly wiped up with a rag before cooking her dinner. Father Dunn rode out when the skies finally cleared, expecting to find a collapsed, muddy tomb. Instead, he found Kathleen calmly hanging clean laundry on a line strung between 2 massive cottonwoods. His face betrayed sheer shock. When she proudly showed him the gravity-fed drainage system, he stood in his damp cassock, nodding slowly, and was forced to admit he had been entirely wrong. The structure was remarkably sound. But, he warned ominously, the true test was yet to come: the Dakota winter. Kathleen had spent all of October meticulously gathering fuel, cutting dead cottonwood, elm, and ash using a borrowed crosscut saw, sectioning the timber into precise lengths to fit her cracked iron stove. By early November, she possessed a massive stockpile, 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, stacked just outside her entrance and covered with an abandoned canvas tarp she had scavenged near the railroad tracks. But on November 12th, the fatal flaw in her conventional exterior storage revealed itself. A light 2-inch dusting of snow fell, melting by the afternoon, completely saturating the porous canvas tarp. When the temperature rapidly dropped that evening, the outer layer of her critical firewood supply froze into a solid, impenetrable block of ice. Green or wet wood is a death sentence on the frontier. It produces blinding, choking smoke and yields barely half the British thermal units, BTUs, of properly seasoned timber. She was forced to bring wet, freezing logs inside to dry near the stove, leaving her constantly one day behind, burning dangerously inefficient fuel while desperately trying to evaporate the moisture out of tomorrow's supply. She tried reorganizing the pile, but the snowstorms were increasing in frequency, and Werner Hauptmann was charging an extortionate $1.20 for new canvas tarps she simply could not afford. Frank Cordell casually suggested she move the entire woodpile inside, but that would consume half her livable square footage and introduce a terrifying fire hazard. Sitting at her scrap lumber table one freezing evening in late November, staring blankly at the 8-inch wide, 10-inch deep drainage channel running the entire 9-foot length of her east wall, the genius solution materialized. That meticulously engineered trench, which had saved her during the October floods, was currently sitting completely empty and useless for the next 6 months of frozen winter. If she constructed a heavy wooden cover for it and sealed it correctly, she would instantly possess a subterranean firewood vault capable of holding 2 weeks' worth of fuel, kept absolutely bone dry and shielded from the violent snow and rain. The very next morning, she walked into Hauptmann's yard and purchased 8 feet of 1x12 pine for 80 cents. She ordered him to rip the boards into 3-inch widths, and spent the entire evening custom-fitting the timber to bridge the trench. She fabricated the cover in modular 2-foot sections, allowing her to lift specific panels to access the wood below. She aggressively sealed the joints where the pine met the earthen walls with her proven clay grass mortar. The physical mechanics of the system exceeded her wildest expectations. She could densely pack split wood into the floor channel, drop the pine boards back into place, and seamlessly walk across them as if they were a standard floor. The timber remained flawlessly dry. The ambient earth temperature permanently prevented the logs from freezing solid, ensuring they were always primed for immediate, high-efficiency combustion. And because the vault ran inside the insulated envelope of her home, she could refuel her stove without ever exposing herself to a lethal blizzard outside. But Kathleen elevated the engineering one magnificent step further, a detail that arguably saved her life. She recognized the physics of convection. By deliberately cutting a small, strategic opening in the back corner of the wooden cover, precisely where the trench met the rear wall near her iron stove, she created a thermal bypass. The intense, radiated heat from the cast iron was forcefully drafted down into the channel. This circulating current of hot, dry air actively baked the stored firewood, aggressively driving off any residual moisture, before naturally rising back up into the main living space. She had miraculously transformed a simple drainage ditch into an active, passive solar-style heat distribution and wood kiln system. The true horror of the Dakota winter arrived on December 22, 1878, striking the territory like a physical blow. The ambient temperature collapsed to 18 degrees below zero and did not rise above the zero mark for 11 agonizing days. This was the kind of profound atmospheric violence where the moisture in a man's breath freezes instantly in his beard, where exposed flesh suffers irreversible cellular death in under a minute, and where the sap inside the great elm trees expands and shatters the trunks with the concussive sound of a rifle shot. The town of Bismarck paralyzed. Mrs. Halterman was forced to shutter the dining hall for an entire week because no amount of coal or wood could elevate the building's internal temperature to a survivable working level. Families in conventional, stick-framed houses burned frantically through their meticulously calculated winter fuel reserves twice as fast as projected, watching the frost creep relentlessly up the inside of their bedroom walls. Down in her $10 dugout, Kathleen Brennan was burning roughly half the wood she had originally budgeted. Because the geothermal Earth temperature at an 8-foot depth permanently maintains roughly 55 degrees, at that specific latitude, she was fighting a much smaller thermodynamic battle. She was starting from a baseline of 55 degrees, while the townspeople were starting from -18. She would fire the cracked stove briefly in the morning, and once more in the evening, raising the interior air to a balmy 68 degrees. The massive thermal inertia of the compacted clay walls would trap and hold that exact temperature for hours on end. The firewood, curing beautifully in her subterranean convection channel, burned with ferocious, smoke-free intensity, while grown men with decades of frontier experience were desperately feeding green fence posts and wet, ice-crusted logs into their failing hearths. This 16-year-old girl sat in quiet, steady warmth. Physics is the only judge that matters. By mid-January, the economic reality of the deep freeze set in. Mrs. Halterman reopened the dining hall, but brutally cut her staff, reducing Kathleen's hours to just 3 days a week. Her cash income evaporated exactly when she desperately needed to purchase supplemental winter rations. But her firewood vault was still heavily stocked, and she possessed the sharp intellect to realize that her wealthy, skeptical neighbors, like Frank Cordell, were running dangerously low on combustible fuel. On January 18th, with the deadly air sitting at a staggering 12 below zero, Kathleen loaded a heavy hand sled with a full week's worth of perfectly kilned bone-dry wood and physically dragged it the 2 miles to Cordell's sprawling, freezing estate. She did not demand cash. She simply offered the premium fuel in fair trade for whatever provisions he deemed equitable. Cordell, shivering in his grand frame house, stared at the split, pristine cottonwood as if she were offering him solid bars of gold. He vanished into his pantry and emerged with a heavily smoked ham, 2 massive pounds of milled cornmeal, a sealed jar of preserved beans, and 6 pounds of raw oats. It was a haul of vital calories that Kathleen could not have purchased with 2 full weeks of dishwashing wages. Word of her surplus dry wood spread through the desperate community with incredible speed. By early February, the girl who had been cast out into the snow was actively supplying premium fuel to 5 different, prominent families, consistently receiving a massive premium in trade, because dry firewood in a Dakota deep freeze is an absolute currency of survival. She never price gouged. She executed fair, honest trades that kept families from freezing to death in the dark. Then came the ultimate vindication. Werner Hauptmann, the arrogant Prussian lumber baron who had mocked her project, arrived at her dugout in late February, begging to buy wood. Standing at her threshold, feeling the powerful wave of 68-degree air wash over his freezing face, he stared past her at the meticulously clean interior, the glowing iron stove, the brilliantly engineered floor channel, and the perfectly preserved supplies. He immediately contracted her for regular wood deliveries through the remainder of the winter, offering $1's worth of premium hardware for every 3 days of fuel. But Hauptmann possessed a merchant's eye, and he recognized a paradigm shift when he saw it. Bismarck's commercial merchants suffered horrific financial losses every single winter due to inventory spoilage. Root vegetables, apples, seed grain, and expensive fabrics routinely froze in drafty sheds or rotted in the summer heat. A massive, properly ventilated and drained earth-sheltered facility, maintaining a permanent 50 to 60 degrees, would revolutionize local logistics. Hauptmann offered the 16-year-old girl a staggering proposition. He would finance all materials if Kathleen would serve as the lead engineer and architect for a massive commercial storage dugout behind his lumber yard, utilizing the exact proprietary techniques she had pioneered in her own home. She negotiated a ruthless, brilliant contract, $2 a week during the active construction phase, plus a permanent, ongoing percentage of the gross storage fees once the facility was operational. Furthermore, she demanded the right to hire Frank Cordell's eldest son for the brutal excavation labor, having learned the limits of her own physical endurance. They broke the hard earth in March and completed the massive structure by May. It was an architectural marvel compared to her humble shelter, spanning 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, and boasting a 12-foot ceiling at the entrance. The hydraulic engineering was identical, but massively scaled up. A complex network of gravity-fed drainage channels hugging the walls, keeping the deep earth perfectly dry, alongside a dedicated covered timber vault that Hauptmann used to protect his most expensive premium milled lumber. By July, the storage facility was wildly profitable. Hauptmann charged 15 cents a week for a 4x4-foot storage block, quickly securing 12 commercial clients. The total elimination of the freeze-thaw cycle meant spoilage plummeted to near zero. One merchant proudly reported his apple loss dropped from a catastrophic 30% the previous winter to less than 5% in the dugout. Kathleen's passive percentage yielded roughly $4 a month in pure profit. To put that in perspective, she had previously broken her back for 35 cents a day. The financial success was profound, but the ideological victory was absolute. In August of 1879, Father Dunn, the priest who had accused her of sinful pride, personally escorted a young stonemason from Illinois named Robert Callahan to Kathleen's door. He humbly asked if she would teach the man her principles of prairie construction. She spent 3 days instructing the mason on reading topography, cutting south-facing slopes, engineering inward-leaning retaining walls, and implementing her gravity drainage systems. Callahan built a flawless dugout along the Heart River and went on to construct 6 more across the territory, utilizing Kathleen's exact blueprints. Not a single one ever flooded, collapsed, or failed. By 1881, Kathleen Brennan had personally overseen or consulted on the construction of 14 hyper-efficient, earth-sheltered dugouts. With her accumulated wealth, she filed a formal homestead claim and purchased the 160 acres of land surrounding her original $10 hole in the bank of Apple Creek. In June of 1882, she married a Norwegian wheat farmer named Erik Svensson. While they eventually built a conventional frame house in 1883, they meticulously maintained her original dugout. The covered floor trench ensured they possessed an endless supply of kiln-dried wood, and the thermal stability preserved their family's food supply for decades. Modern architectural engineers analyzing Kathleen's 1878 design are utterly staggered by her intuitive grasp of physics. The floor channels she dug are the exact hydraulic equivalent of modern, highly regulated French drain systems. Her mud and grass mortar was a primitive but structurally perfect natural fiber-reinforced composite. Depicted, identical in structural theory to modern fiberglass. And her greatest innovation, the covered firewood trench that drafted heat from the iron stove to dry the fuel and warm the floor, was a flawless execution of passive solar design and heat recovery ventilation, advanced thermodynamic concepts that the mainstream architectural world would not formally codify until the energy crises of the 1970s. Earth-sheltered buildings, operating on her precise principles, are now proven to reduce heating and cooling energy demands by up to 70%. There is a letter preserved deep in the Bismarck Historical Archives, written by Father Dunn to his regional bishop in 1885. In it, the priest specifically names Kathleen Brennan, confessing that she had taught him a profound lesson in Christian humility. He admitted he had arrogantly presumed to know what shelter a young woman required, when in truth, She had understood the harsh reality of the Dakota land far better than men with decades of experience. Werner Hauptmann's commercial storage dugout operated flawlessly until 1912. Frank Cordell publicly praised her vernacular engineering at a county fair in 1905. The final archival record of Kathleen Brennan, is the 1920 Montana census. It lists her as a widow, aged 58, her occupation simply marked as farm woman. There is no official mention of the thermodynamic principles she mastered, the 14 families she sheltered, or the arrogant men she silenced. But her original dugout stood intact until at least 1904. A surviving photograph from 1890 shows the roof thick with heavy prairie grass, the drainage ditch worn deep and smooth by decades of protecting the structure, and the small, salvaged glass window looking out over the frozen creek. She had been thrown out into a 14 below zero nightmare with nothing but a hammer and $4. Every established authority figure told her the earth would be her enemy, that her design was suicide, and that a teenage girl could not survive alone on the frontier. She listened to them all, politely, and then went into the freezing mud and proved that observation, deep intelligence, and an intimate partnership with nature will always triumph over arrogant assumption. If you found value in this story, if you believe that the ingenious solutions of the past still hold vital lessons for our future, hit that like button to help others find these stories of profound creativity. Subscribe to preserve this knowledge.